Well, thank you to the friends for inviting me to speak on a topic that I'm quite passionate about, Ocean Falls. I have been given 40 minutes and I could probably take 4 hours to cover the territory only superficially. So what I'm planning to do is break this talk into 6 sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about me and how I became an author of a book about Ocean Falls. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book because the story of the production and distribution of the book itself is quite interesting, and that will include some of the sources. I'm going to talk about the town, both its physical and historical aspects. And I'm going to talk something about the people. The people, of course, were the most important quality in the place. And I will speak about some special occasions. And then I will close by just commenting on the theme of the talk, which is the unique aspects of Ocean Falls as a company town. Just by way of introduction, I am a lawyer. I still work full-time, and I've practiced law in the Cowichan Valley for 45 years. Much of my work now is actually done online, remotely. It's only trials which require human bodies and oral testimony, which require the use of a courtroom. But I've been doing this now for about 8 months. And if you saw the recent video of 2 lawyers and a judge in Texas with a filter, I am not a cat. That was something that went viral throughout the legal community. I would just like to say at the outset, I know it's appropriate to acknowledge traditional territories, and I happen to be sitting on the south shore of Cowichan Bay. I'm overlooking Cowichan Bay, and probably 158 years ago, in the summertime, I would be seeing flotillas of canoes of the Cowichan people heading towards their traditional fishing grounds at the Fraser River. I would also be seeing, in 1862, the arrival of the first settlers by a Hudson's Bay Company ship to settle the agricultural lands of the Cowichan Valley. I'll be talking about an area that is the traditional territory of the Heitzook people, primarily the people that are now based in Bella Bella, but in the millennia before the arrival of Captain Vancouver in 1793, they were dispersed throughout the area around Ocean Falls, including Ocean Falls. So I will be discussing primarily the history and the unique qualities of a town that essentially began in 1903. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the town and its history. I'm going to touch on some of the unique people that made the place so special and some of the special occasions. And I will be closing about talking about Ocean Falls now. It has morphed into a relatively unique digital experience, and I'll be telling you something about that. So first, something about me. I arrived in Ocean Falls in 1953, and I am one of, I estimate, 70 or 80,000 people who at one time called Ocean Falls home. My dad was one of the 2 doctors in the town from 1953 until 1968, and he brought his young family to Ocean Falls for the reason why most people went to Ocean Falls, and that was to make money. Ocean Falls was a prosperous town throughout its existence. The mill paid high wages, and it was a place where you could go to make money, in many cases, like my dad and many other significant people in Ocean Falls, to pay off student debt and move on. Guess who was one of those people? Our Premier, John Horgan, worked in Ocean Falls in the summer of 1979. He went there because he knew he could make money. He was supporting a widowed mother and siblings, and John has very, very fond memories of Ocean Falls and was, of course, one of the first recipients of the book. I lived in Ocean Falls from the age of 5 to 20, and I did my entire elementary school in Ocean Falls, and I went to grade 9 when I was shipped off to boarding school. And I say shipped off, I think I was goofing off in school, and my parents thought I would be better off. So I went to Shawnigan Lake School, only 20 miles from where I am right now. But the experience of going away to school, both to boarding school and university, gave me a unique perspective on the place. And I say I was both an insider and an outsider. As a child, up until the age of 14, I was involved in everything. And Ocean Falls, amongst other things, was a child's paradise. And I joined every club, I participated in every sport, and I really loved my life there. And I was a very reluctant participant in the boarding school life. Fortunately, I adapted to it very well, but I would come home at Christmas and Easter and summer holidays, but it was never quite the same. I was now, in the words of some of my friends, the doctor's son that went to the snob school. And I would generally, in coming home, get off the boat or the plane and immediately go to work in the mill. And so I developed a sense at the time of the uniqueness of the place. And I realized this is a place that I'm very privileged to have come from. And I started collecting stories. And I was always a keen observer of human behavior and human interaction. And I just collected stories. And fortunately, I have a good memory and I remembered most of them. And that was the source of much of the work of the book. I must say at the beginning, when I'm talking about sources, particularly in the context of a presentation for the Friends of the BC Archives, I can't say enough about the contribution that the late Claire Gilbert, who was the archivist who put together the Ocean Falls collection, made to the history of the place. Fortunately, there was a bequest made by a fellow by the name of Jeff Taylor, who was a leading author on the early industrial history of BC. He's written books about shipyards and mining and the timber industry and industry in general. And as part of his will, he left a significant amount to the archives. And my understanding was some of that money was used for the Ocean Falls collection. And the Ocean Falls collection is an outstanding collection. It's one of the best community collections in the archives. Claire put it together, and unfortunately she died 2 years ago. But I think it's most important that I acknowledge her contribution and the contribution of Mr. Taylor. So I was also very fortunate in that I had really good history teachers, and some of you on this broadcast may well be history teachers. And I can just say to you, you can give a gift, a love of history that will keep on giving. I was fortunate to have Harry Higgins in Ocean Falls and Graham Anderson in Shawnigan, and I developed a love of history, and it continues to this day. And this book is a product of that teaching. So I just can't stress enough how important the teaching of history in our schools is, and we must never, ever forget that. And I know I'm preaching to the choir on that topic. So I was an insider and an outsider. I had an appreciation of the uniqueness of the place, and I collected stories and I collected photographs and realized how important Ocean Falls was. The importance was only magnified in 1986 when the town was essentially destroyed. When I lived there, there were 3,000 relatively prosperous people. All were there for one reason, and that was to work. After 1986, the population dropped drastically to less than 100, and now there are probably 30 permanent residents there. The physical qualities of the town are crumbling. It is one of the wettest places in British Columbia, and the climate and the dampness is taking its toll. but the memories of the place are very, very strong. And there's almost a clan-like bond amongst those of us who grew up in Ocean Falls and call ourselves rain people. We have reunions every 5 years. We had one in Duncan just 2 years ago. And it was probably the best reunion of them all, because those of us who attended were all kids in the glory years of Ocean Falls in the 50s and 60s, and to a lesser extent the 70s. And we had a wonderful childhood, and we were able to get together. There was about 500 of us here in Duncan, and share those memories. And we realized that we're family, and when we're gone, a lot of these memories and this unique aspect of this town of Ocean Falls is going to be gone. So let me tell you a bit about the book and how it came into existence. I realized it was a story worth telling, and I would write pieces, generally essays, about different aspects of the town when I had the time, whether it was on holidays or weekends or long weekends. And I would just I collected all of my research material on index cards. If I ran into somebody in the street, they told me a story about Ocean Falls, I'd write it on an index card. So after about 50 years, I had about 6 boxes of index cards. And that became the primary source of my writing. I put the book together, and as I was doing so, I had a call from Howard White of Harvard Publishing. He said, "I hear you're writing a book about Ocean Falls. We'd be interested in it." And so finally, when I was done, I sent it to Howard, and it was 300,000 words. And Howard said, "That's way too much. We want about 100,000 words." So I said, "Well, I'll get somebody to edit it." And a good friend of mine is somebody who may be known to many of you, is Richard Mackey, now the publisher and head honcho of the Ormsby Review. So I hired Richard to edit the book, and I gave him my 300,000 word collection of what I would call essays and even memorabilia, and he edited it down to 250,000 words. And he said, "Brian, a book is as long as it should be, and this one shouldn't be any less." Harbor didn't want 250,000 words. They wanted something small that could fit on the bookshelves of the BC ferries. So I said, "Well, here's your advance back." I sent them back the whopping great sum of $500, and I said, "I will self-publish." And fortunately, I was in a position to do so. So I then embarked upon the task of publishing the book myself. Richard had taken this rather disorganized collection of essays and put it into what you see now, and it's more of a historical context. I started with about 6,000 photographs, and I morphed them down to about 300. I commissioned a number of maps from Eric Leinberger, who is, I believe, associated with UBC. And I was able to use the original art of Michael Dean, a Ladysmith artist who's done a lot of stuff about Ocean Falls, and put that all together. Richard again helped me put the package together. I then had the task of actually designing the book, and was fortunate that a fellow by the name of Mike Whalen from the Sunshine Coast area really wanted to do this book. He had a background in magazine publishing, and he designed the book and put it together and did a phenomenal job. Then it came to printing. I had to figure out, how am I going to get this in some physical form? I went to Craig Schemmelt of Island Blue in Victoria. He put the book together, and lo and behold, after about 18 months of this process of editing, design, and printing, I had a product. Now, here comes the hard part. How do you get that product into stores? Well, I designed the website, and I got a lot of inquiries from the website, but I really wanted to get it into bookstores. And so I literally went on the road, primarily on the island, and I went to every bookstore on the island and said, "I've got a book about Ocean Falls. Would you be interested?" Well, of course, they're polite and they say, "Yes, we are," but they're not exactly, it's not exactly going to be the next bestseller. So just to give you an example, I went to Monroe's and they said, well, we'll take 2. So I showed up with my 2 books at the counter, and standing at the counter was somebody asking for the book, because just prior to my delivery of the book, a review had come out in the Times Colonist written by Jeff Johnson, and this fellow was asking for the book. Just to give you an example, Monroe's has sold over 200, and the book has had a great, for a self-published book, it's done very, very well. I don't know if I would recommend to everybody to go the self-publishing route, but if you've got the energy and the resources, by all means do so, because you retain complete copyright, you can retain complete control. The challenge, as I say, is getting the book into the bookstores. The research that I did, including my own memory, it's very much autobiographical. The interviews that I had with hundreds of people, and I made a point of talking to people in different walks of life, whether they were nurses or mill workers or Italian immigrants or managers or teachers or bowling alley managers. I talked to them all to get their different perspective on the place. And I tried to tell their stories through sidebars, and part of the design of the book includes a lot of sidebars with different anecdotes from different people. I must say the most valuable source of information, and I hope she's on right now, was a lady by the name of Gwen Swan. Gwen is what I call the keeper of the flame. She grew up in Ocean Falls. Her family goes back to the 1930s when her grandparents arrived. Her brother was the longest resident of Ocean Falls. Her brother Jim, known as the Rain Man, lived there for all 63 years of his life. Gwen put together an absolutely remarkable archival collection, and she's put it all in great big binders that used to be used to bind carpet samples, and she's got 5 of these. They weigh over 100 pounds, and she's got everything from swimming pool receipts to cafeteria menus to you name it, plus every article that was ever written about Ocean Falls. It's an absolutely invaluable source. I actually asked Claire some years ago if there's some way that the archives could digitize it and put it with the rest of the collection, and it hasn't yet been done. So that was an incredible source of information. The BC Archives information was very, very good. A lot of it is online, and a lot of it is in the archives. Another excellent place was the BC Legislative Library. There they had all of the newspapers, articles, and magazines ever printed about Ocean Falls, and another great source. The Vancouver Archives has a phenomenal collection of photographs done by a photographer in the 1940s and early 50s by the name of Don Coltman. And a lot of his photographs appear in the book. I'm going to say something that some of you may not want to hear, but I found dealing with the BC Archives not the most pleasant experience. I felt like I was an elementary school student going back to school. I found the staff quite rude. I found the protocol of the use of the archive material very, very cumbersome. And I really found that the insistence on copyright of photographs, particularly this massive collection that was donated to the BC Archives by Crown Zellerbach, and insisting on copyright for it was just inappropriate. I may be stepping out of line here, but I think the photographs in the BC Archives should all be in the public domain. By being in the public domain, they're going to get out to the public, which is essentially where you want this stuff to be. So enough for that political comment. I would also like to acknowledge a guy by the name of David Leverton, who digitized every piece of literature he could get on Ocean Falls, whether it was newspaper articles, high school yearbooks, union newsletters. He put it all online, and it's just an incredible source of material. So let me talk now a bit about the town. The town was carved out of the wilderness in 1903. At that time, the provincial government was wanting to develop industry, particularly pulp and paper industry, and they were offering pulp leases to people who were prepared to build a pulp mill. And one of the first pulp leases issued was to a fellow by the name of Simon Mckenzie in 1903. He bought the site, and the photograph behind me is of that site. It's a painting by a Duncan artist called Laurel Hibbert, and he bought the water rights to what the Heitzoek called the Liak River, and which eventually became called the Link River. And that was the start of industry in Ocean Falls. Of course, the Heitzoek used the area around Ocean Falls for millennia before that. And in fact, Captain Vancouver visited Ocean Falls in June of 1792 as he and his men were rowing the tenders of the Discovery and the Chatham, which were based about 20 miles away from Ocean Falls, and examining every nook and cranny of the BC coast, of course, looking for the Northwest Passage. So after Mckenzie, who was really a speculator, got the rights to the water and the land around Ocean Falls, Americans came in. And the story of Ocean Falls for the next 75 years is really about American capitalism. Initially, it was a fellow from Seattle by the name of David, or Lester David, and he created what was called the Bella Coola Development Company, later called the Bella Coola Pulp and Paper Company, and later the Ocean Falls Company. And in 1906, they started to build what became the pulp mill. The first industry in Ocean Falls, interestingly enough, was a sawmill, and most of the product of that sawmill was used to build the town of Prince Rupert, which Grand Trunk was hoping to be the next terminus of a Trans-Canada rail line. A pulp mill was up and running by about 1910. It was a pretty rudimentary affair, and it didn't make money, and it didn't last very long. It went into receivership very shortly after starting up. And one of the fortuitous events in the history of Ocean Falls was the involvement of a guy by the name of Archie Martin, who came along and took the company out of receivership. The company was then bought by Crown Willamette, which was based in Portland, which was partly owned by the Zellerbach family of San Francisco. They completely rebuilt the mill. Interestingly enough, during the First World War, with a collection of people who didn't sign up and go overseas, and miraculously, in 1917, the first newsprint came off a machine in Ocean Falls, and it continued to come off continuously until 1980. But Archie Martin was really the father of the town. He was an American based primarily in Portland and latterly in San Francisco. The town became a true company town when Martin took it over. And Martin's legacy to the town was that he realized the importance of recreational, educational, health facilities, all of those things other than the means of production which go into making a community. And he realized the importance of that. And that's why Ocean Falls thrived, because it had these types of amenities that many other company towns didn't. A lot of company towns, mining towns, logging camps, fish canneries, they're very, very rudimentary. They lack the essentials of what we would consider civilized life. Ocean Falls had all of those things, notwithstanding its remote location and its terrible climate. It's the wettest inhabited community in North America. It gets over 200 inches of rain a year. Victoria, by comparison, gets 30. Vancouver gets about 40 to 44. So you can imagine the need to attract good people. And the way you attracted good people was providing them with amenities that went beyond a good paycheck. So Archie Martin got the place up and running in 1917, 1918, and the town essentially thrived for the next 65 years or so. During the Depression, it continued to operate. Everybody went on what was called short time. In other words, they shared their work. Instead of working 5 days a week, they worked 4 days a week. During the war, during the Second World War, Ocean Falls was booming. Paper, of course, was a commodity in demand. In addition to making paper, Ocean Falls, interestingly, produced the spruce lumber that was used for mosquito bombers in the Second World War. And another interesting fact is that most of that spruce lumber was manufactured by a workforce of women. Because there was a shortage of male labor, they had to hire women. And in the war years, there were 300 to 400 women working in the mill, many of them in the sawmill. And they worked in the sawmill because the tolerances and the specifications for this spruce lumber, it had to be perfectly grained, not free, for the mosquito bombers. And they found that the women were the people that paid the most attention to the detail required to produce that type of a product. After the war, North America, in fact, most of the world went into an economic boom, and those really were the boom years of Ocean Falls. Most of the infrastructure that I was familiar with, the new store, which is owned and operated by the Hudson's Bay Company, Nelson's Laundry, which had the first private enterprise in the town, the theater, the hotel, all got built in the late 40s, early 1950s. What we called the hotel, known as the Martin Inn, named after Archie Martin, was the third largest hotel in British Columbia. Only the Hotel Vancouver and the Empress in Victoria were larger. And the hotel really was a glorified bunkhouse. And that was one of the legacies of the post-war boom. That hotel still stands. Like most of the places in the town, it is decrepit and probably should be destroyed. But it was at one time an absolutely thriving place. It had a pool hall, 2 cafeterias, housing for 400 men, a beautiful ballroom, which we called the Blue Room, where we had our grad dances and our Christmas dances and wedding receptions and that kind of thing. Barber shops, hairdressing shops, everything was in that hotel. And it was, as I say, the third largest hotel in the province. Our family's sojourn in Ocean Falls just happened to correspond with what I would call the golden years. We were there from 53 to 68. During that period of time, the town was booming and everybody was making good money. And it was a very, very prosperous place to be. And this is one of the unique qualities about Ocean Falls. It was very prosperous. Everybody made good money. It was a company town. And with the exception of about 80 residences outside the town in a place called Martin Valley, all the houses were owned by the company, and the rent was subsidized. We lived in a 4-bedroom home, and I still have the lease that my dad signed. It was for $35 a month. So it was a place where you could go, and if you were so inclined, you could save money and move on. And the legacy of Ocean Falls is that there are a lot of people, my generation and younger, whose parents worked there and they got their start in this province or this country in Ocean Falls, and they were able to move on. And the prosperity and the economic security fostered by Ocean Falls lives on to this day. So continuing with the historical trajectory, things changed, and they changed, and I can almost pinpoint it to a date. January the 13th, 1965. There was a terrible slide in Ocean Falls. Ocean Falls is built on the side of a mountain, and the part of the mountain gave way and came down and killed 7 people. And again, if you have a sense of history and you know anything about Ocean Falls, you know that's when the tide turned. After that, they started shutting down machines. People started to leave. And by 1972, only 7 years after the slide, Crown Zellerbach, which had essentially been the company of the company town for close to 60 years, decided it was going to get out. The town was no longer economical. There were a number of reasons for that, which I won't get into. And they were about to close the town in March of 1973 when the NDP government under Dave Barrett, but really orchestrated by Bob Williams, saved the town. And they bought the town and created a crown corporation called the Ocean Falls Corporation, which ran the town and the mill from March of 1973 to May of 1980. During that period, they had a difficult time making money. They made money a couple of years. Part of the problem, and this is a problem that is endemic to the forest industry, was a lack of a dedicated fiber source. To make paper, you need three things. You need lots of water, which will be used in the production process as well as for the generation of electricity. You need lots of fiber, wood, preferably hemlock and spruce, and you need good people. And Ocean Falls had problems with all three of those things in the 1970s. So by 1980, the Bennett government was in power, and they did not want to be in the paper business. And so they closed the mill in 1980. The mill sat in mothballs until 1985. In 1985, another interesting process took place called normalization, and that resulted in the destruction of most of the buildings in the town. In 1986, what was left of the mill infrastructure, the machine was auctioned off. And so that is the historical trajectory of the town. The people of the town, I think, are the most important thing. And I just like to talk a bit about the people. In the 1950s and 60s, when I was there, they were very cosmopolitan. We had a huge European immigrant population who came from the devastation of places like Poland and Italy and even Germany after the war. And there was a tremendous cosmopolitan aspect to Ocean Falls. You would never think of it. And the joke was, if somebody spoke with an accent, what accent is that? The answer is, it's an Ocean Falls accent. Somebody estimated there were people from 50 different linguistic groups living in Ocean Falls in the 50s and 60s. The result was you had this great mix of cultures, which made for an absolutely fascinating place to grow up. I could tell stories, and if you get the book, you'll see the sidebars of some of the stories. One of the most fascinating is the story of Otto Tankon. Otto Tankon was the father of my good friend Gino, and Otto was a longshoreman. He came to Canada, leaving his family behind in Italy for 5 years, found a place in Ocean Falls, and brought his family out. His cousin, Albino Luciani, was Pope Paul I. And this was the kind of mixture you would get in Ocean Falls. Another person who lived in Ocean Falls, his mother was Doris Lessing, a Nobel Prize winning author. We got these people who ended up in Ocean Falls because it was a place where you could get a job and make some money. I tell the story of a lot of these people in the book, and they really are what make the place great. Perhaps the most famous person with a connection to Ocean Falls, and it's a very strong connection, is Richard or Dick Pound. Dick is the Canadian representative on the Olympic Committee. He is a man of many, many accomplishments. He was the chancellor of McGill University. He's a leading tax lawyer, author. Dick lived in Ocean Falls from 46 to 54. His father was one of the managers at the mill. And despite his present position in the world. He was named some years ago as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He still attributes everything to his background in Ocean Falls. I talk about some of the other unique people. Flo Danshin, a phenomenal lady who came as a child bride in 1948 and was one of the last people to leave in 1986. What I call shirt-tail relative, Jim Gregg, my sister married his son, was the manager of the mill in the last days of the mill when Crown's Ellerback was disposing of it. And he had just a phenomenal memory of Ocean Falls. One of the things that I didn't mention in the historical trajectory, but is so significant, is the story of the Japanese. From 1920 until 1942, the Japanese made up 1/3 of the population. We know what happened in December of 1941. By the spring of 1942, 700 of the 2,100 people from Ocean Falls were evicted, all Japanese. And it's a sad, poignant story, and it's a very significant part of our history. It's actually captured, one of the Japanese residents, Roy Nakagawa, wrote a book, Ocean Falls, the town that I was born in, and it captures a bit about the Japanese life. Interestingly, there were other ethnic groups there. The Sikhs, I just read a book about the history of Todd Inlet, and a lot of the people who were working in what we now know as Birchard Gardens, the Sikhs that worked there, went to Ocean Falls and were a very significant cohort in the 1920s and early 1930s. Another significant cohort were the Chinese, all of course single men, and they worked in a definite part of the mill. They worked in the sawmill and the flume that delivered the logs to the groundwood mill. Because Ocean Falls was this unique place, there were two distinct classes of people. There were the families who tended to stay for long periods of time. I basically had the same kids in my elementary school class every year. And then there were the single guys or single women who came in to make a buck and get out. They generally didn't last very long. The turnover in the mill workforce, which was 1,000 people in the time that I was there, was 100% a year. So 1,000 people came, 1,000 people left every year. And that's where you get to, how did this place end up having 70 or 80,000 people? It's because the turnover was so high. And it was high primarily amongst the single guys. The other demographic factor that is very significant is the ratio of men to women was about 20-1. And that, perhaps more than any other single factor, contributed to the high turnover of men. Most of the women were either nurses or teachers if they were single, and they didn't stay long. I think I was fortunate as an elementary school teacher. We always had these teachers who were basically fresh out of university and really enthusiastic. And they had nothing else to do except work. And so they were phenomenal teachers. And I had a great elementary school experience. The other people that worked there, the women were nurses. My dad was a doctor, and the nursing staff all lived in a nurse's residence. And our house was literally across the sidewalk from the hospital. And my dad used to boast, because the nurses were so good, a lot of them were midwives from England, that he could get a phone call, deliver a baby, and be back in bed in 20 minutes. And that's because they were so well trained and the footprint of the town was so small. I should say a bit about the geography of the town. The picture behind me captures a bit of it. It was completely surrounded on 3 sides by 4,000-foot mountains. In the winter, right now, the sun would just beginning to shine over what we called Goat Mountain to the south of the town. For 4 months of the winter, you rarely got sun in the day. Rain, of course, was normal. I don't recall the rain being that bad, but I was a kid. What did it matter? When it did rain, it really poured. 6 inches in a day was not unheard of. Other interesting geographical features. Water everywhere. We had Link Lake behind us. It's pictured behind the dam in the picture behind me. We had what we called the Chuck, Cousins Inlet, in front of us. We had the Martin River, which was a very productive salmon-bearing river just outside of the town. So water was everywhere. And one of the things about water that was so important to what became one of Ocean Falls' most significant accomplishments and calling cards was the need to swim. In 1928, there had been a lot of drownings in Ocean Falls, and they decided they better build a swimming pool to teach the kids how to swim. So the profits of the beer parlor, which was probably one of the most profitable beer parlors in the province, went towards the construction of the swimming pool. And so much beer was drunk that the profits generated in 8 months paid for an indoor swimming pool. Now, this pool was not the Crystal Garden, and it was not the Commonwealth Pool. It was a 20-yard, 4-lane pool, but it became known as the Pool of Champions. And one of the amazing stories of Ocean Falls is its swimming team. Between 1948 and 1972, there was somebody from Ocean Falls on every Olympic swimming team, and Ocean Falls swimmers, particularly the males, were by far the most successful of Canada's swimmers in international competition in that era. That could be a whole nother topic, but one of the reasons for that was there were no cars, no TV, and a very small footprint in Ocean Falls. So everybody walked everywhere. And it was built on the side of a mountain, so most of your walking was up and down stairways or hills. We were all exceptionally fit, and that fitness played out in the swimming pool, and in fact, in other sports. It was a very, very athletic town. But the story of the Ocean Falls swimming team is a remarkable one. The team is in the BC Sports Hall of Fame. Richard Pound, George Gate are members of the Order of Canada, due largely to their association with the sport of swimming, which was born in Ocean Falls. So, I mean, I'm looking at my clock in court. We have one of these digital clocks in front of us, and I have one here, and I'm told that my time is up. I just like to close by saying a few things about Ocean Falls now. Most of the town is gone. The mill is completely destroyed. There are about 30 people there. The things that remain are a power plant that generates hydroelectric power transmitted to Bella Bella and Shearwater, a ground-based fish hatchery, and interestingly enough, because of the surplus of electric power, a company called Ocean Falls Blockchain Corporation. Ocean Falls is now a Bitcoin mine, and because of the massive amounts of power needed to run the computers that manipulate the algorithms that produce Bitcoins, Ocean Falls is one of the sources of that. And if you follow investments, Bitcoin was over 50,000 bucks US per coin last week, and so there might be a good future. Unfortunately, it doesn't employ anybody, not like the 1,000 prosperous, happy people that worked there in my day. The one thing that is left and is in good shape is the graveyard. There are 500 people buried in Ocean Falls. No one ever visits those graves. Curiously, there's an area of the graveyard where there are 70 infants called Babyland buried. Nobody ever visits those graves. Otto Tankon, the Pope's cousin, is buried there. Bob Fisher, the coach of the swimming team that was inducted into the Hall of Fame, is buried there. So the physical aspect of the town, because of its location, it will never be visited by many. It's too remote, too expensive to get to. And it's why events like this and organizations like the BC Archives are so important. We must never forget the contribution of the ordinary people, the hardworking people who went to places like Ocean Falls that produced what we take for granted today. And if I can close just by saying thank you to the BC Archives, thank you to the Friends for continuing this legacy. And I think I haven't extended my time too much, so I'll leave it at that. And if we've got time for questions, I'd be pleased to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that extremely engaging and evocative talk. So little of this history was familiar to me, having been born long after the heyday of Ocean Falls. And yeah, there's just so many facts I'm going to go tell my partner about as soon as I'm finished this talk. And you've also been extremely gracious in talking about all the records and the local knowledge keepers and residents who helped to share this history. And I just think that's a testament to your work and character. So I'm going to stop there. So we have lots of time for questions. We can have time for 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how many questions are there. But I'll turn the floor over to Lara Wilson from the Friends, who will be moderating the Q&A. Over to you, Lara.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your attention, and what a tremendous turnout today. So please put your type your questions in the chat, and I will read them out.
Just while we're waiting, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I really didn't touch on the theme that was the main topic, which is what made Ocean Falls unique as a company town. And there are a few things it did. One was its durability. Most company towns didn't last 70 years. Ocean Falls was probably one of the longest lasting towns. And actually, it was Claire Gilbert who said Ocean Falls was the quintessential company town. Another aspect of Ocean Falls that made it unique was the community amenities that I already spoke about. Most company towns did not have the community amenities that Ocean Falls enjoyed. Another aspect of Ocean Falls arose from its isolation. Because of its isolation, work was valued and creative work was valued. And because it was an industrial complex, you just couldn't phone up the nearest parts store, the nearest industrial supply store to get a part if something broke. You had to make it. And the people of Ocean Falls were renowned for their creativity and their work ethic and their ability to get by in very, very difficult times.
We have some questions coming in. First of all, we've had a question about where your book is sold. So if one of my colleagues could put the link back in. So our first question is from Donna. She said your presentation cut out briefly when you mentioned South Asians and Sikhs. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, the South Asians came from the quarry, which we now know as Butchert Gardens. And they moved, probably about 20 or 30 of them moved to Ocean Falls and stayed there for about 10 years. And I just mentioned that the story of the Sikh working force in the Butchert quarry at Todd Inlet is very well told in a book that has just been produced about Todd Inlet. And I can't remember the name or the author, but it's an excellent book published by the Royal BC Museum.
Thanks, Brian. John has a comment. Mr. Bennett was my social studies teacher at Handsworth in North Vancouver, gave me a lifelong love of BC history and great presentation. So just thanks for that. Haymar mentions that he visited Ocean Falls a couple of years ago and it was very haunting.
Well,
John,
Haymar, I must say,
yeah.
I know who Haymar is.
Yeah.
And Haymar was one of those people that I went to Shawnigan with, and he and I think, both developed a love of history through Graham Anderson. And Haymar went on to make a career of that. He is Canada's leading legal historian.
We have two questions in a row from John. He asks, have any TV shows or movies been filmed at Ocean Falls?
I don't know if there have been any TV shows or movies. There actually is an interesting novel by Harold or Hammond Innes, and it's set partly in Ocean Falls. It would make a great site for a TV show or a movie. There's actually quite a bit of stuff on YouTube, sort of amateur productions with visits to Ocean Falls, and some of it's very good.
Another question, who owns the land now?
Good question. It's the majority of it is owned by a private individual, and unfortunately there is some dispute with that person. He has allowed it to fall into ruin, particularly the buildings, and but it is privately owned, and I know who owns it, but I won't mention it on air.
Okay. A question from Tammy. She says, although my ideas and viewpoints of Ocean Falls are romanticized through the eyes of nostalgia, the way things were, is there any hope, even as remote as the town is, for it to come back, although in a different form?
I don't think so. I think it is too remote and too isolated to become anything other than what it is now, a site for some form of industry which is based on people flying in and flying out. The power plant, I think, employs about 5 or 6 people who work on a 2-week in, 2-week out shift. The same for the fish hatchery. It's a land-based fish hatchery, and the Bitcoin operation the same. There are some permanent residents there. I'm not sure of their source of income. But it's never, ever going to be the type of place that it was in the 50s and 60s, primarily because it's really expensive to maintain. The climate and the isolation and the terrain are very, very hard on any kind of infrastructure. The company at the end was spending $1 million a year just to keep the town from falling into disrepair.
Thank you, Brian. Here's a question about the resources available at BC Archives from Mona. Are there info or photos available to see at the archives about the building of the town, and specifically the buildings designed and built by C.R. Luthwaite?
Yes, I think there are. As I say, the BC collection is an excellent collection. I just touched the tip of it. I was more interested in the social history of the place, and not so much in the industrial history and the design aspects of it. But there is a massive material in the BC Archives. Another very, very good source is the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley, which is the repository of all of the Crown Zellerbach material. And I gather it is a huge collection. If somebody wants to do a PhD thesis on Ocean Falls, delving into the industrial side of it, there is a wealth of primary material in those two places.
Okay. Kevin asks, what proposals have there been for the town after the shutdown? Wasn't there a proposal to export water from there to the US?
The answer is yes, and lots. There have been lots of proposals, and particularly in the 1980s, every harebrained scheme, particularly driven by somebody who wanted to use somebody else's money, was thought of. There was a plan to export water. It was promulgated by a company called Western Canada Water. If you want to Google them, they got involved in lawsuits. They were involved in a major confrontation with the province of British Columbia over the right to export what I call Canada's soul, its water. And there was a plan for an industrial waste incinerator. There was a plan for a prison. A Korean company wanted to put in a thermomechanical pulp mill, but with, again, government money. There was a plan for taking a lot of up in that part of the world, there's a lot of scrub cedar, and using that to create particle board. None of these panned out.
Okay. Hamar would just like to say, good on you for acknowledging Graham Anderson as a history teacher. Okay.
Yeah, we're
Yeah.
both the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah. Folks are sharing some resources, including a documentary on YouTube. Rhonda would like to say, from a kid's point of view, yes, it was great to have a teacher like Chester Lawson and many others added to this experience. Gwen and many others. I lived there from 8 until 16. In 80, when I had to leave to finish school due to the closure, thank you for sharing the piece of about it being the third largest hotel. Jesse put in the link to the book by David Gray on Todd Inlet into the chat. So thank you, Jesse.
There you go. Yeah. Very good book.
Excellent. Jerry asks, Brian, I am trying to put together a lesson for the BC Labor History Project on Ocean Falls and company towns to be used in high school classrooms in the province. And I would love to chat with you, maybe get your input on this. Is that possible?
Yeah, it's more than possible. I have to tell you an interesting story. Of those 50,000 words that were cut by Richard Mackey, there was an entire chapter of 5,000 words on company towns of the BC coast. And it's a story in itself. And Richard said, well, this should be an article in Rain Coast Chronicles or something like that. But when you think of it, most of the early communities in BC were essentially company towns. And that includes Victoria, which was a Hudson's Bay company town, Vancouver, which was essentially a CPR town, Nanaimo, which was essentially a Dunsmuir collieries town, plus all kinds of other towns from Antioch in the north to James Island in the south. And the history of the BC coast was the history of company towns. People went to these places to work. It was only in places like the Cowichan Valley or the Saanich Inlet or the Fraser Valley where the sort of the traditional agricultural or agronomy took place. Most of BC was resource extraction, and company towns were the norm. And it's a fascinating tale. And as we've said earlier, Ocean Falls was the quintessential company town. It was the biggest, it was the most durable, it was the one that had the most success. And, you know, I attribute that to the American owners, that when it came to company towns, they knew what they were doing. And most importantly, they knew the importance of amenities other than a good paycheck to keep workers.
Thanks,
But
Brian.
by all means,
Oh,
if somebody's interested in following up on company towns, send me an email, and I'll even send you the piece that I wrote that may find its way into some publication sometime.
great. I just want to say there are lots of notes of appreciation for this talk in the chat. So that's just wonderful. We have a question from Russ. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Brian. I had heard years ago that someone was offering walking tours of Ocean Falls town site and that BC Ferry stopped there. Do those still continue? Does BC Ferry stop there still?
Yeah, the answer is yes, except this year in COVID, no. Ocean Falls was completely closed this year. The year before, the Northern Seawolf, which is the new ferry for BC Ferries that serves the mid-coast. And by the way, if it's running again, if you get a chance to do it, take the trip. Certainly go to Bella Coola. My wife and I did the trip from the lower mainland up across the Chilcotin Highway to Bella Coola and then down on the Northern Seawolf to Port Hardy. Phenomenal trip. The Northern Seawolf does a side trip into Ocean Falls, Bella Bella, and Clem too. There are walking tours. There are some people there who still have a very strong sense of the history of the place. A fellow by the name of Les Marsden operates sort of a B&B called the Old Bank Inn. It's in the old CIBC Bank. But I'm ambivalent about encouraging people to go to Ocean Falls. There really isn't much to see there. And the only people that would be really attracted to the place are people like me with memories of the place when it was at its prime. It can be somewhat depressing, even for those of us who grew up there. I actually found it thrilling to go. I went up in 2013 for my 65th birthday. It was my 65th birthday to myself. And it was a wonderful trip, but I knew what to look for. And it was also part of my research for the book. But in terms of a place to visit, unless you are a real history buff with an interest in the archaeology of modern BC, I would not recommend it.
A question from Tammy. Tammy asks, should the hotel be demolished, would the fireplace plaque still be preserved?
Well, answer is, I think the hotel should be demolished. It's so run down and it's so full of mold and even stalactites now. It's a concrete building. The demolition would be a very expensive exercise, and I'm not sure what you do with the refuse, but the fireplace must stay. If you read my book, I refer to it as a site that would be out of Ozymandias. It's an archaeological site with a testament to Archie Martin written across the granite of the fireplace. It is something that is unfortunately seen by very few, but is just a phenomenal piece of archaeology and history.
I just want to say we're gonna push the envelope as far as we can. Jesse and I have been chatting so we can go to hopefully about 25 minutes after the hour to try to get as many questions answered. Jan asks, why did Ocean Falls stop attracting good people in the 70s?
Another really good question. I think the whole ethos of the place changed. And I pinpointed again to 1965. Not only did the slide occur in 1965, TV came in 1965. Before the arrival of TV, everybody was involved in clubs, outside activities, sports, you name it. When TV came, people stayed home and the community spirit changed. Also, TV exposed the population to the world outside. And that world outside included cars and, all the luxuries and the junk that you see advertised on TV. And people in Ocean Falls thought, maybe we're missing out on something here. So TV was a big factor. And people just expected more. The days of living and working in an isolated place, particularly for single men, were over. Those men, whether they work in Fort McMurray or Dease Lake or any remote industrial enclave, they fly in for 2 weeks and fly out for 2 weeks. They're not prepared to go and stay there for months at a time.
Thank you. Donna notes that there is a panel at the Vancouver Convention Center that tells the story of Ocean Falls.
Yeah, let me tell you that story. I was sort of responsible for that whole diorama. And this goes back to the BC Labor folks. I'll try to make the story brief, but I wanted to put up a statue honoring the people of Ocean Falls at the Vancouver Trade and Convention Center when it was being constructed during the Olympics in 2010. I went to David Podmore, who was in charge of the project at the time, and he said, we're looking for an art theme for the Trade and Convention Center. Your idea of honoring the working people of the coast is absolutely perfect. I'm going to contact Jack Monroe and we're going to put this together. Well, the theme became the theme of the Trade and Convention Center. The diorama, including the piece on Ocean Falls that appears in overlooking Cole Harbor, was part of that. The statue never got built.
Yeah. Teresa asks, the stained glass window that was put in the Anglican church after the landslide, where did that end up?
It ended up in, yes, it ended up in a church in Kitsault.
Okay.
Up in the northern part of the province. Kitsault is another company town, and it is adjacent to, quite near Stewart, and that's where the stained glass window is. It actually honors the Decker family. The Decker family was a family of a mother and father and 2 little children, all of whom were killed by the slide.
Very poignant. Thanks to Donna. Donna has uploaded I think a photo of the Rain People plaque to the chat.
Yes, that's the one at the BC Trade and Convention Center.
Okay.
And my understanding is that that plaque is being updated because it ends in 1972, but the story of the town, particularly the working town, didn't end until 1980. So they missed out what I call the government era. And one of the people who posts regularly on the Ocean Falls website, Ocean Falls Where's That, is seeking to have that plaque updated.
Okay. Rhonda has a comment. There is a tourism site at the Vancouver waterfront about Ocean Falls. On it, it speaks of its closure in the 70s, though it was a blip in the 70s and didn't really close until 1980. So it'd be nice if that was corrected.
That's just exactly what I just said.
Yeah.
And it is apparently going to be corrected.
Okay. Yeah. So, oh yeah. Okay. Got it. How many printings of the book are there?
I've printed 1,000. I'm out.
Okay.
Monroe's may have a few left, but I am about to order another printing, and I'm going to be putting in some new material into that. One of the things that I was optimistically hoping for is that John Horgan would give me a piece. He's got other things to do and he hasn't done so now, but if anybody watching here has any influence over John Horgan, it would be really nice to have about 500 words from him on the importance of Ocean Falls to his development, because I know from others it was a very important part of his life.
Okay, folks, you know what to do. Question from Jesse. What was the relationship between the managers and the employees like at Ocean Falls?
You know, it was very good.
Okay.
It was not confrontational. In fact, there was a strike in 1957 and 1958 where the company brought hot meals from the cafeteria at the hotel to the guys standing on the picket line. And then at the end of the strike, a company, in fact, it was my relative, Jim Gregg, who wrote the men, and they were primarily men, saying, we're going to give you a break on the rent on the company houses because things have been tough for you and you don't have to pay it back all at once. It was very good. The company became unionized in 1937, and it was a very, very smooth transition from a non-union workforce to a union workforce. There was always, the petty squabbles that go on in a union environment, but nothing ever bad. And the relationship between the unions and the management was actually quite positive.
Thank you. Phyllis and Bill note that John Lovelace of Wings Over Canada has produced 2 TV shows on Ocean Falls. And Gwen Swan, who is able to join us today, says that there are still small landslides happening because of the rain happening now.
Yeah, well, I'm absolutely delighted to see that Gwen is on because, as I say, I think she has contributed the most significant archive for Ocean Falls, and any of us associated with the town owe her a huge debt of gratitude. She is the primary poster to the Ocean Falls Where's That website, the Facebook website, which is another source that I used. There were earlier a group called Yahoo Groups, and then the Ocean Falls Where's That. And by just checking on that every day, I find out what's important to people and what they remember. And it's so touching to hear the fond memories that people, particularly of my generation, have of the place.
Another question. Was there a relationship between Ocean Falls and the Moose Canning village when both were thriving?
The only relationship was there was a lot of interaction both back and forth. Namu was about 50 miles from Ocean Falls. It too was a company town in a sense, but it was only really operating in the summer when the salmon were running. It was very prosperous. At one time, it was a great place for particularly the First Nations from Bella Bella. Entire families would move from Bella Bella to Namu for the summer, but there was no connection. Namu was a BC Packers town. Ocean Falls was a Crown Zellarat Canada town.
Tammy wants to let Gwen know that there is some debris up at the falls today in the catch basins. And
she'll know what that means.
Yeah. Yeah. And Dave says, I'm interested in the pipe band. My dad learned to play there at about 1957, and thus he can play. So
well,
that's a nice connection.
Now, you've asked the right guy, because across the street from us lived the Stewart family, and Mr. Stewart started the pipe band during the strike in 1957 and 1958. And Arthur, his son, and I tried to learn the bagpipes by playing chanters. And Arthur went on to be a piper. I gave up the chanter in about 3 weeks. But the pipe band was a very important part of Ocean Falls in the late 50s, early 60s. They were always there for every celebration, whether it was the rain-soaked parades at Labor Day or Dominion Day, or welcoming the swimmers back from the Olympics. I often wondered what happened. They had wonderful uniforms, and I often wonder what happened to all of that.
We have a question from Cal. Are there many homes being lived in Martin Valley?
The answer is yes. I would say of the homes in Martin Valley, as many as 50% are used. A lot of them are summer places. At one time, a number of Americans bought places there primarily to go fishing in the summertime. The population that lives there now resides primarily in Martin Valley because the houses are privately owned and they weren't destroyed during the normalization process in 1985. Curiously, our house, the doctor's house, is the only house occupied in Ocean Falls town site, and it's occupied by one of the fellows that works at the Boralex power plant when he's in for 2 weeks.
Okay. Thank you. Elspeth comments that BC Ferry should have a lecturer on board for that run.
Yeah, you know, you're right, and I got to tell you a funny story. I was on the Northern Seawolf a year ago last summer, and word got out that I was on board and I was the author of the book. Well, I had every crew member come up to me with their copy of the book, and I sort of presented my own little lecture to the crew members, and then they said the same thing. You know, we'd love to have somebody on board telling these stories because they're fascinating. But I've got to say that writing this book has been the most rewarding thing, other than having my children and marrying my wife, that I have ever done in my life. I've had a great life. I really enjoy what I do. I love practicing law. I'm 72 years old. I still work full time, but the writing of this book and the feedback that I've got on this book, primarily from my fellow RAIN people, has been just incredibly rewarding.
Wonderful. There's lots of chat in the chat. A reminder that this recording will be on our YouTube channel. Colin asks, the CBC or NFB made a film around 1974 or 75, and it was quite extensive. Is this ringing a bell? Do you know where to get it?
I've seen most of these, and Gwen would certainly know where they are. If you dig deep into YouTube, you will generally find them. I know the one on the CBC one because there was an interview, and Ocean Falls people online right now will know some of the names. John Robinson, who was a teacher at Ocean Falls and the father of my good friend Ken, Pat Kennedy, A number of these people were interviewed, and I think that was a CBC production. There have been many, many productions. The Wings Over Canada that was referred to earlier, I've heard that. There have been a lot of things done about Ocean Falls. Curiously, there's a great song written about Ocean Falls, and it's called Ocean Falls, Where's That? And if you go on to YouTube, you'll find it. There's also a very poignant YouTube video that includes that song with interviews with some of the First Nations people from Bella Bella, who had a strong connection with Ocean Falls. I should say, when I was there were very few First Nations people working in the town, but the fishing industry was thriving, and the First Nations from Bella Bella were absolutely outstanding fishermen, and they were much more interested in that type of an environment than the smelly confines of a pulp mill. But in the 1970s, during the government era, a lot of First Nations from Bella Bella ended up working in the mill. And my understanding is that they made a great contribution to the mill and really quite enjoyed the opportunities that Ocean Falls provided to them at the time.
Charles notes that Dale and David McMillan remain friends with Mr. Horgan.
Well, and that's for good reason, because Mr. Horgan lived in their house.
Gwen just would like to say that she has a case of Brian's books that she's selling for Brian. And Carol asked Gwen, could I buy a book for my mom, Margie?
Well, there you go, because Gwen probably has, one of the last collections of books that haven't been sold, but yeah. I'm hoping that within a month or two we'll have another good supply. Yeah. This is a book which, interestingly enough, will never go out of print. There will always be a demand for it, and I say that as an author. Yeah. I'm not going to make my retirement fund from this book, but the rewards have been far beyond the economical.
Here's a question from Lori. Did E.J. Hughes ever paint Ocean Falls?
No, he didn't, but I believe he was there. He went up the coast in 1952 on the Standard Oil boat that serviced primarily fish canneries and logging camps, the Imperial Nanaimo. And he did a really great painting of Namu, and he did a number of paintings of Kumshwa Inlet on the Charlottes. He may have gone into Ocean Falls, but I don't think the Imperial Nanaimo serviced Ocean Falls. They got most of their fuel from a barge rather than the Imperial Nanaimo, because the fuel needs in Ocean Falls were way beyond what the Imperial Nanaimo could deliver.
Okay. And just
I wish he had, because I'm a huge E.J. Hughes fan, and I would have bought that painting.
And I have Robert Amos's books. E.J. Hughes Paints Vancouver Island over there somewhere, as I point off screen. But anyways, two last comments from the chat. One from Sue. Ron Stewart was Piper at our wedding in 1980.
That was Arthur's dad.
And Dan says, thanks for your book and presentation, Brian. It added so much to the stories I'd heard from my dad over and over again growing up. So that's the chat.
Okay, well, I mean, I can just close and say I have received, almost hundreds of letters from people with an association from Ocean Falls about the book, a lot of them contributing their own stories, and some of these stories will appear in the next version of the book. But it's interesting how people are attracted to Ocean Falls and the memory of Ocean Falls. I think the further we are removed from it, the more important it becomes. And it was such a unique environment that, as one of the people said at one of the reunions recently, we were really quite privileged to have grown up there. And as I said at the outset of my speech, it really was a children's paradise. We played outside all the time, no matter what the weather. The rain didn't seem to bother us. Doors were never locked. There were always things to do. There were always places to go. There were always clubs or sports to participate in. And I think that's why the reunion in 2008 was so wonderful and warm, because it was essentially a collection of kids that had grown up there.
Thank you, Brian. Just a couple of more things. Jennifer Rice is the MLA for Ocean Falls, and she's on the call today. And she said that she will ask John Horgan to write a blurb for your book.
Thank you.
And since we've got Jennifer on the call, we'd like to note let her know about our past communications with the government about licensing and reproduction fees. So an ongoing advocacy issue for us. But what a wonderful talk today. Thank you everybody for your questions. Jesse, do you have anything to close?
Just to say thank you again so much, Brian, for sharing all your truly encyclopedic knowledge about Ocean Falls with us, and for taking the time to prepare your presentation and to answer questions. Thanks to Lara, Kelly, and Thomas for helping to run the show here with me, and to all of you for attending. If you enjoyed the presentation today and would like to learn more about the Friends of the BC Archives, you can visit our website or find us on social media. We'll be posting a version of this talk to our YouTube channel, so you can find it there if you want to share it with others or watch parts of it again. Our next event will be on March 21st, and Ken Mather will be joining us to talk about the Caribou Wagon Road and some of the extensive research he's done around that. So that's March 21st. And if you'd like to support the work of the Friends, you can do so by becoming a member or renewing your membership, and there's information about that on our website. So once again, thank you all so much for joining, and especially to you, Brian, for sharing all of the information you've collected about this town. And we hope to see you all again at another Friends event or on social media. So take care.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having an interest in Ocean Falls. And I'm honored to have been able to participate. Thanks again.